super excited to be here. It's such an honor to have shared the stage with so many fascinating and exciting speakers. Can we take a second real quick, though, to clap and thank Igor and Adam for organizing such an incredible conference? Oh, I've moved forward a slide, but that's all right. Okay, so I wrote this book with my husband called A City on Mars, and we ended up writing this book after doing the research for our first book, which was called Soonish. And while we were researching Soonish, we had a chapter on cheap access to space, which was mostly about how SpaceX has these reusable rockets, which are doing this incredible job of dropping the cost of sending mass to space. And there was also a chapter on, can we start my 40-minute timer? Thank you. There was also a chapter on companies preparing to mine the heavens and the plan that these materials could be used not back here on Earth, but they could be used to start space settlements. And between these two pieces of information and then listening to folks like Elon Musk telling us that by 2029 we're going to have boots on Mars, and 3 decades later we're going to have 1 million people, we thought, okay, we must have everything else figured out, and all that's left is that this is an expensive project, and very soon we're going to be able to do it because it's going to be cheaper and we can use materials in space. So we convinced our publisher to pay us to write this book. And about 2 years in to writing the book, we started calling ourselves the Space Bastards, because we noticed that we were becoming much more pessimistic about space settlements becoming a near-term possibility. And when we were talking about space settlements, we're specifically interested in like having babies on, on the surface of Mars, for example, and then having multiple generations after that. And, part of the reason why we started calling ourselves the Space Bastards is because, we'd go to parties and people would say, you can't see borders from space. Settling space is going to solve all of these problems. We're going to get along better. But you can see borders from space. You can see Pakistan and India. You can see Korea and North Korea. And cosmonauts will tell you this. Maybe some astronauts, too. I only talk to the cosmonauts. And then, I have a friend who's interested in asteroid mining, and he read an early version of the book, and he said, gosh, you're just relentlessly depressing. And that was on my mind when Igor said to me, now keynotes are supposed to be inspirational. And so today I'm not going to talk about these as things that are holding us back from becoming multiplanetary. What?
You can.
What? Okay, but these are opportunities. See, I'm being optimistic. These are opportunities for you all to contribute to making humans multiplanetary. There's a variety of problems that need to be solved as we take on this, perhaps greatest journey that humans have ever set out to tackle. So we're going to talk about some problems, but first we're going to talk about where we're going to go, and some of this is going to repeat what Guillermo just said, so I might speed through some of it a little bit. So almost no one is proposing that we go to Mars to create a long-term self-sustaining settlement. The moon I meant. So the moon has a great benefit if you just want to learn about living in space. So it's practically next door. Apollo took a couple days to get to the moon or to get back. And that's great because if something breaks or it turns out that that space radiation is really bad, it would be nice to be able to get home quickly. So it's nice to be close. Additionally, folks are excited about settling or creating an economy on the moon because the Earth has a deep gravity well, so it's really expensive and really difficult to lift mass out to Earth's orbit. But on the moon, it would be cheaper. So maybe this could be like a way station to get to better places like Mars. But the moon is a difficult environment to work in. So at the equator, temperatures can swing from negative 130 Celsius to positive 120 Celsius. Trying to get lubricants for your equipment that can work in those temperature swings is really difficult. Also, days last for the equivalent of 2 weeks on Earth, and nights last for that long as well, which means if you're relying on solar power, you need to have incredible battery packs to store the power you're going to need. Also, the regolith is awful. So regolith is this layer of dust. So on Earth, the dust and dirt that we have gets sort of rolled smooth by the wind and the water that we have on this wonderful planet of ours. But instead of that happening on the moon, you get massive temperature swings that, break it into pieces, and then it gets bombarded by micrometeorites and it fuses back together. So you get these teeny tiny particles that kind of look like little knives made of glass and rock if you put them under microscopes. And they're small enough that there's some concern that if you breathe them in, they could scar your lungs and could cause something called stone grinder's disease, where it gets difficult to breathe if your lungs get scarred over and over again. Additionally, the regolith is electrostatic. So you can see that for this astronaut, his pants are starting to get dust on them. So they chose white to help keep him cool, but it clings, and so it gets dark and it gets warm pretty quickly. And the Apollo astronauts also noted that it's super sharp, so it just kind of scrapes and rubs on everything. So this is going to make creating equipment that can work in this environment long-term difficult. But there's some cool stuff on the moon and some cool stuff we can learn about. So they've got these lava tubes. So essentially there used to be lava flowing on the moon, not anymore. As it moved through, it would sort of harden out an exterior area. And after the lava finished passing through, you end up with this like open spot in the center. And I think it would be super cool to live in a lava tunnel, or to at least see it explored. And so here's what a lava tube looks like on Earth. And lava tubes have some benefits. So those crazy temperature swings that I mentioned at the beginning, they're moderated if you're inside a lava tube. You're protected from space radiation, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. Regolith will be less of a problem because most of it has been fused together by that lava. And you get protection from micrometeorite impacts. And so we know that you've got these kinds of lava tubes on the moon and on Mars. So these are places where we could go to start to learn about living in space. Another benefit is that on the moon, so you don't get the tilt that you've got on Earth, which means you have less seasonal variation at the poles. So there are poles that are almost constantly getting direct sunlight. And so if you get a rim around a crater, you can find areas where there's over 80% of the time there's sunlight. So these are called the peaks of eternal light, but they should probably be the peaks of almost kind of eternal light. But still, it's much better than at the equator where you have to wait for 2 weeks to see the sun again. Here, if you put solar panels up and you lift them up a little bit, you can get sunlight 80, maybe 90% of the time. So that's gonna help with your solar panels. But the craters are something like 1/100th of a billionth of the surface area of the moon. So it's something like 2 tennis courts, but maybe you can extend that area out if you get really tall poles for your solar panels. So there's not a lot of this area, but this would be a good place for us to go to start learning to live on the moon. And then the dark interior of this crater is a place where you can find water ice. There's a little bit of water in that regolith that I was talking about, but there's more water in concrete. So it's going to be hard to get the water out of that. So the water here is ice. It also has a little bit of carbon in it. And that's helpful because the rest of the moon is carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus poor. So you probably don't have enough of what you would need to start a settlement or enough to do your agriculture. You're going to need to bring a bunch of stuff in. You can get some carbon from here. That would be helpful. You can get some water from here. Actually, my husband and I were trying to figure out where the most concentrated sources of carbon on the moon were. And we think they're probably the feces and vomit bags left behind by the Apollo astronauts. But those are heritage items, and NASA would prefer if you didn't grow your garden in Neil Armstrong's long-lost bowel movements. All right, so this dark interior has water, and water is not just great for drinking. It's great for, you can break it into oxygen. Now you've got your breathing gas. And you can break it into hydrogen and oxygen, and now you've got an energy source, fuel cells or rocket propellant. It's nice that there's water, but there's actually not that much. So, when you think about giant sources of fresh water, maybe you think about Lake Victoria, Lake Superior, Lake Erie. The amount of water that's expected to be in those craters is 10% of Sardis Lake, which is a man-made lake in Mississippi, which none of us have heard of because it's a small lake, not really worth thinking about. So when people start telling me about using the water on the moon as propellant, that makes me a little nervous. There's a lot of it, but not so much that maybe we want to be burning skyscrapers full of it into the vacuum of space and losing access to it forever. So I think we want to be careful about how we use the water that we have on the moon so we can preserve it. Okay, so the moon is a place where we can go to learn how to set up habitats, learn how to get water in these tough environments, places to settle permanently. I used to say that there's 2 places worth thinking about settling permanently, but now Venus has a very charismatic spokesperson, so we'll add Venus to the list. So Mars, I think, is the place where we're most likely to be able to settle space well, although Venus has its merits. And so Mars has some things going for it. So it has a day-night cycle that's pretty close to what we have here on Earth. The temperature is fairly mild, so over the summer at the equator, it can be about room temperature, so that's okay, we can handle that. It has an atmosphere that is 1% of what you find on Earth, and a lot of that is carbon dioxide. That doesn't sound super exciting, but if you do the Sabatier reaction and you mix carbon dioxide with hydrogen, you can get methane, which is a great propellant, which makes me think it would be easy to leave Mars, which sounds good. But anyway, it's a propellant to get to other places, and also a source of water, which of course can be broken up so that you can also get breathing gases. So Mars has a lot more of the stuff that you need to survive. Another downside of Mars, which Guillermo already told us about, is because of orbital mechanics, you can't leave to head to Mars at any time. You have to wait for there to be a right window. And when you leave for Mars, it takes somewhere between 6 to 9 months to get there. And then you have to stay for about a year. And if you're heading back, it'll take about 6 to 9 months to come back. So if you are on your way to Mars and something goes wrong, you're kind of stuck. Probably there's not going to be any emergency crew that can get out there to get you and help you in that situation. Additionally, there's a 3-minute delay when Mars is closest to Earth and you're trying to communicate with someone back home. And that delay can be as long as 22 minutes when Mars is farthest from Earth. So it might be hard to get real-time input during an emergency. Additionally, Mars has regolith, kind of like the moon, but that 1% atmosphere is enough to let it get whipped up into dust storms that sometimes cover the entire planet and can last for days or weeks. This is going to make solar panels a little bit difficult to rely on. And additionally, the soil on Mars has perchlorates in it. This is an endocrine disrupting hormone that messes up the hormones that are produced by your thyroid, which control things like heart rate and blood pressure. There we go. So you're going to want to remove those from the soil before you start planting plants in there, because plants do pull up perchlorates. So you can eat the perchlorates if you're growing your plants in them. All right, so that's a quick overview of Mars. There's also a lot of folks who are excited about rotating space stations. This idea became popular in the 70s with Gerard K. O'Neill. And I think these are some of the most beautiful designs for space settlements. We'll talk a little bit later about why these aren't feasible designs, in my opinion. But some benefits here are that, they rotate, so you can simulate 1G, so you can simulate Earth's gravity. If it turns out that that's a showstopper for humans in space, then we can create sort of Earth-like environments inside of these. Also, they can be put just about anywhere in space. Usually they're proposed to go into Lagrange points, and I'm sure the physicists are going to cringe at my explanation here, but these are just areas where gravity is kind of canceling out, so you don't have to use a lot of propellant. You can stay in one spot without getting sort of pulled by other heavenly bodies. But these are really hard to make. We don't have these kinds of habitats yet. And one of the problems is that you have to make them pretty big. So if it's too small and this habitat is rotating, the smaller it is, the more you're going to kind of feel like you need to puke. And so we need to make these big enough that it can rotate, sort of slowly, so you're not really feeling uncomfortable all the time. But, the International Space Station is only 108 meters across, and it was $150 billion to build. So these are expensive projects. No doubt it'll be cheaper because we'll have learned a lot from the International Space Station, so that will drop our costs a little bit. But I often see proposals for 450 meters diameter, and that would be a very expensive thing to build. Another problem is that you see these beautiful glass exteriors, but if some space debris were to come through one of these windows, this whole thing is sharing the same airspace. And so everything would decompress at the same time. So more recent proposals that I've seen, the only people who have ever died in space are the 3 cosmonauts who first were aboard Salyut 1 in 1971, and they died when a hatch opened and they were exposed to the vacuum of space. So this is a scary problem. And so most proposals these days include not beautiful glass exteriors, but something a bit more radiation resistant, and modular design. So these pill-shaped habitats each have their own airlock. So if one of them were to experience decompression, it wouldn't be awful for everybody else as well. So this is not what I felt like I was promised when I started researching this project, but I think this is a much safer design. There are some benefits to rotating space stations in that the exterior has a different gravity regime than the interior. So Neil's semiconductor research could happen in the middle here, and you could have people living out on the exterior. So that's a benefit for these rotating space stations. Right, and then there's Venus. All right, so those, which we enjoyed hearing about for 20 minutes, so I'm not going to belabor it. So space and the human body, those are the places we're likely to go. Let's talk about some of the challenges. So when I started researching this book, I knew that we had had space stations orbiting Earth since the 70s. So 50 plus years of data, 600 plus astronauts sent to space. I thought that we had figured out most of the problems related to how the human body responds to the space environment. But there's actually a lot that we don't know. So starting with radiation, radiation in space is different than the kind of radiation we tend to experience on Earth. So the sun is shooting out protons. Every once in a while there'll be a solar flare, and every once in a while those solar flares are associated with solar particle events. And a particle event is sort of like, if you were to call a tsunami a water event, those are sort of similar. Tons of protons are getting shot out. But space is big, and usually those are going to miss humans. But if they don't miss humans, they could kill you, or they could cause lots of problems, including giving people cancer. We know this is also bad for our equipment. So in 2003, there was a satellite orbiting Mars, and it had a sensor for radiation that got hit by a solar flare, and it choked on the data, and it completely died and was no longer able to give radiation data anymore, which would have scared me if I was a person living on the Martian surface when that happened. There's also galactic cosmic radiation that we think you get when stars explode. This includes small stuff like protons and helium, but also some bigger stuff like iron ions that, if they shoot through your head. There was an experiment done where they made a gel that they thought sort of was like the human body. And when they shot one of these galactic cosmic radiation iron particles through it, it burst out a hole the size of a human hair, which makes you a little scary thinking about it like going through your brain. This can also be a problem for our equipment. So there's a funny story in Terry Virts's memoir where an alarm goes off and they start panicking, like, oh no, what is this alarm saying? And Samantha Cristoforetti says, that's the ammonia alarm. That means ammonia is leaking. And so ammonia is used to cool the American segment. And this is like a super toxic thing. You don't want to get ammonia on you. So when you hear this alarm, what you're supposed to do is put on your oxygen mask, float over to the Russian segment, seal the American segment, and get naked. And you might be wondering about one of those steps there. So the reason you go to the Russian segment is because they use glycol and not ammonia, but also, and glycol's not toxic, but also maybe you're wondering why they have to get naked. And that's because if they had ammonia on their clothes, they're supposed to take their clothes off and leave them on the contaminated side. Apparently the idea of seeing their coworker naked was just unacceptable. So even though the alarm was going off, they kept their clothes on, but they went into the other segment. It turned out that the alarm was a false alarm, and they think it was caused by galactic cosmic radiation hitting one of the sensors and setting it off. So radiation, we know it's a problem for our machines, but we actually don't have a great sense for how bad it is for the human body. So Earth has a magnetosphere that deflects a lot of these charged particles away from Earth or directs them to the poles. We also have an atmosphere that protects people on Earth from a lot of this radiation. But the International Space Station is usually orbiting within the protection of the magnetosphere. So astronauts are experiencing something like 2 to 3 times less radiation than you would experience if you were outside of the magnetosphere. So if you were somewhere like, the surface of the moon, Mars, or a rotating space station. So not only are they not getting exposed to all of the radiation that you would encounter in a place like Mars, they're also up there for pretty short periods of time. So the longest stay is 437 days by cosmonaut Polyakov. And so, I talked to some radiation scholars, and basically they said the current state of knowledge is, maybe this causes cancer. We're not even really sure of that. We just don't have good data because there's not that much you can learn from astronauts protected by the magnetosphere who are up there for months at a time. We're getting a little bit more data now because labs like Brookhaven now have devices that can simulate galactic cosmic radiation. So we can start studying this in rodents a little bit better. But at the end of the day, we don't have great data on humans for how this kind of stuff might impact our body. And that includes problems like cancer, but also things like oxidative radiation, and maybe even some cognitive problems. Some scholars hypothesize that could happen when you've got particles sort of shooting through your brain. So habitats are probably not going to look like this. Probably you're not going to have these beautiful glass domes, and this was disappointing to me because I thought it would be amazing to live in a glass dome on Mars. But these glass domes would permit radiation to get in, and space architect Brent Sherwood noted that, yes, you always see these visions of these amazing glass domes, but those glass domes would probably be baking the inhabitants inside and giving them cancer. So our habitats aren't going to look like this. Most of the proposals that I saw included burying habitats underground or piling that awful regolith on top of them, or maybe storing your water as a shield around your station. But there's another problem, which is that when radiation hits your habitat, it can interact with the materials that your habitat is made of and break it into brand new kinds of radiation. And so I feel like with space, almost every problem you dig into, the deeper you dig, the more complicated it gets. But that's fascinating. These are really interesting problems for us to solve. I'm being optimistic. But it's complicated. But this could be a fun materials science problem. So these are, I wrote it down because I knew I'd forget. Hydrogenated boron nitride nanotubes. This material is thought to be good at absorbing the secondary radiation that gets made in habitats when primary radiation hits your habitat. All right, so then there's gravity. So astronauts on the International Space Station spend something like 2 to 3 hours a day exercising, something like 5 to 6 days a week. So that's a lot of exercise. But despite that, they still have problems associated with being in essentially free fall all the time. So one of those problems is that their hips tend to lose something like 1% of their mass every month, again, despite all this exercise. And during a 6-month stay, they can lose something like 13% of the muscle mass in their calves. And, again, we've had astronauts up there, like something, maybe 7 or more have spent a year up there. And so we don't really have a good handle on what's going to happen to something like hip bones if you're born in a low gravity environment. So if you're born on Mars, for example, is 40% gravity going to make that 1% bone loss per month go to 0? Or is it going to make that 1% bone loss per month go to something like 0.1%? And that could be a problem if now instead of 6-month stays, we're talking about entire lifetimes on the surface of Mars. Another problem when you're in free fall, and this would be a problem also during that 6 to 9 month journey to Mars, is that without gravity, the fluid in your body shifts up. Susan Helms has a quote that essentially makes it sound like when you go to space, you become far more attractive. And so I'm sure we all feel great knowing that the millionaires who can afford space tourism are also going to look better than us in space. Not only are they going to have more money, but anyway, so this part sounds good, but it also causes some other problems. So astronauts, when they're in space, report nearsightedness when they get home. And so if you're over 40, you're prescribed space anticipation goggles, or SAG. And as someone over 40, I do not appreciate that acronym. I think NASA could have done better. But we think that the problem is caused by fluid shifting up and putting pressure on the eyes and sort of messing with like the nerves and stuff. So again, this is a problem to potentially worry about that might be totally solved by 40% gravity on Mars, but we don't know for sure. There have been some attempts at technological solutions to this problem. So Scott Kelly refers to these in his biography as sucky pants. So the point is they're trying to create like a pressure differential so that the blood moves down into your body like it would if you were in a gravity regime like 1G. They also have a sucky sleeping bag so that you can, get your fluids moving in the right direction while you're sleeping. But they don't have this perfectly worked out. Sometimes if they turn it up too high, you'll like pass out as the fluid sort of drains from your brain. And so we'll have to work on this. But so solving this problems associated with low gravity is an important research area. So if it turns out that we really need higher gravity regimes, then we might need to be in rotating space stations, or we might need to be in the Venusian atmosphere, and Mars and the Moon just might not be feasible settlement locations. Reproduction. All right, there's no kids in the audience. That's great. All right, so as Guillermo also mentioned, we don't really know that you can conceive and give birth to healthy offspring who go on to have healthy offspring of their own. We do know, and this is sort of a funny thing to think about. Not a very pressing issue, but so, when you're in free fall, if you push against your partner, for example, if you're trying to, let's say, dock with your partner, you might accidentally push them into the opposite wall. So there have been some highly innovative people who have worked on some solutions to this problem, like an unchastity belt, a snuggle tunnel, except you have to worry about ventilation because air doesn't move very well in the International Space Station, for example, so you have to make sure it's a fan so you guys don't suffocate in there. 2 suits to sort of zip or Velcro yourselves together, and Heppenheimer thought it would be great to have sex in a space Chevy van. So, to each their own, but I am confident this is a problem humans will solve without too much trouble. I'm more concerned about what happens after that. So, can we have baby, or can we go through conception, and will fetuses come out healthy after they've been exposed to a different gravity regime than what we're adapted to in the presence of radiation? And you get lots of different answers when you talk to professionals about this. So I talked to one medical doctor at a National Space Society workshop who said she didn't think that we could start living in Mars until we had artificial wombs, because you would need to be able to clad it in radiation-proof material, and you wouldn't be able to keep the mom in a little lead-lined capsule the whole time. I don't feel like that's going to solve the problem because that's 9 months out of an entire lifetime. But anyway, there's concern about that. And then there are some people who argue that you can get in a rotating thing so that you can simulate 1G on the surface of Mars if it's important to have a 1G environment during gestation. The good news is here, ladies, you won't have to worry if you're going to get morning sickness or not, because you definitely will. So there's a lot that we don't know about how this will all go. Which I find concerning. We'll move on. All right, waste, food, and closed-loop ecosystems. We've come a long way in terms of handling waste in space. During the Apollo era, they had adhesive bags with this sort of sticky end and then a little cot for your finger to help move things in the right direction. Super gross. Now we have a system of, vacuums that handle different waste, but there's still a level of interaction with waste that I think many of us would feel uncomfortable with. We'd probably get over it, but for example, here's a great quote from Peggy Whitson, noting that after it starts getting full, you have to put on a rubber glove and pack it down. If you're going to be on the moon, you're going to need to get really good at integrating your waste into your agricultural system, because you're going to need that carbon, you're going to need those nutrients that are in there, and in general, we're going to have to get better at recycling our waste. On the International Space Station, the American segment recycles urine. They refer to it as yesterday's coffee when they're drinking it again. But we don't recycle any other waste, so we still need to learn to get better at that. So learning to grow plants, which we might have to do again in our waste to some extent, but learning how to grow plants is not just going to be important for food, it also is psychologically important. Valentin Lebedev, in his Diary of a Cosmonaut, he is relentlessly depressing. I would say it's not fair to say I'm relentlessly depressing. His book is relentlessly depressing. But when he talks about growing plants, he actually has a little bright moment. So growing plants makes some people happy. I kill plants. But you're going to have to be a little bit concerned about how much sunlight you're going to get, because Mars is farther out than Earth, so we get about half of the sunlight that you get on Earth. So you're going to have to be careful about making sure you get enough light for all the photosynthesis that you're going to need. And you're going to want to be working on systems where you recycle as much stuff as you can. And we really don't have a lot of data on how to do this. So probably the most famous example is Biosphere 2. Biosphere 1 was Earth. They were very cute about that. So Biosphere 2 was a 3.14 acre facility in the Arizona desert. They made it airtight, so they measured it, and it was a little bit more airtight than the space shuttle was. And these are glass panels, and they also had these two giant lungs. So, when air gets warm and cold, it expands and contracts. And so they needed these lungs to sort of equalize the pressure to make sure they weren't cracking the glass. And this will be another problem if you try to have glass structures on the moon or Mars. You're going to need some way to equalize the pressure as temperatures change. But anyway, so they had 8 people go in. The goal was to keep them in there for 8 years and to put no additional resources in, just let the whole system recycle. And it went pretty well. So they lost between 10 to 18% of their body mass, and these were not big people to begin with, but they didn't die. They did have to pipe in oxygen at one point, but that was because they hadn't figured out that the concrete was sort of messing with the oxygen and carbon dioxide balance. That could be fixed in a future run. They didn't have the psychology stuff quite figured out, so they split into 2 hateful factions and were literally spitting on each other at one point. So lots of room for progress there. But 8 people went in, 8 people came out, and they had planned on repeating this experiment for many 2-year cycles. But because of mismanagement of the project, it got shut down, and so they only did 1 complete run through. So we do not have the capability to build anything near this big on Mars. So there are other experiments working on smaller facilities. So China has what's called the Lunar Palace, where they work on feeding agricultural waste, like plant parts they didn't eat, to, what kind of beetles are they? Tenebrio molitor. Can't remember the common name. But anyway, to these little beetles. And then they consume the larva as part of their diet to get their protein. And they've done a pretty good job of recycling a bunch of things in this system. But they recently had a run where there were 3 big guys in the system, and 2 big guys had to get swapped out for 2 smaller women so that they'd have enough oxygen for everyone. Needless to say, if that happened on Mars, there'd just be some dead astronauts. But that's where we are right now, in figuring out the equations that you need to figure out these kinds of complicated systems. And we still need to do some work to figure out, all right, there are perchlorates in the soil, so do we not want to bother planting in the soil? Maybe we just want to do hydroponics, where you're growing just right in water, where nutrients are added, but you're still going to need to take perchlorates out of that water, and it gets complicated, but I think it's all doable. But we just need to spend a lot more time working on experiments like this to figure out, how many wheat plants do you need to extract the oxygen produced by a short person versus a very large person? And we just don't really have those data yet. You don't have to be able to recycle everything, but it's always going to be expensive to ship stuff from Earth to Mars, so you're going to want to recycle as much stuff as you can. Power is another problem that we're working on solving. So the International Space Station has these giant solar panels. It makes a cycle around the Earth about every 90 minutes. So for some portion of that, it's in the shadow of the Earth, and it's relying on battery power. So we've got quite a bit of experience using solar panels coupled with batteries to power stations. But first of all, Mars you're going to get about half as much sunlight on Mars as you do on Earth. Additionally, you've got those somewhat random dust storms to worry about, where your solar panels might not be reliable. And on the moon, you've got a 2-week stretch of darkness unless you're on the poles. So most of the proposals that I've seen looking at power requirements, they don't want to rely on solar power alone. They want to include nuclear power, which in some countries is geopolitically dicey, sort of a non-starter. But in the US, there has been some research. There's a research group that makes all of their acronyms Simpson themed. I don't know how many Simpson fans there are, but they also have a Duff reactor. Anyway, so Krusty is the kilopower reactor using Stirling technology. This is a 1 kilowatt reactor that uses fission power. And it hasn't been tested on the moon yet, but they're working on prototypes to do that, and they're working on scaling it up to have more kilowatts of power. But the most relevant piece of information for settling space is Article 2, which essentially says that you are not allowed to appropriate anything in space. So when the United States landed on the moon and we put our flag on the moon, we weren't saying this is ours, because that was not permitted by international law. But it's unclear what this means regarding using and selling resources in space. So to try to clarify, NASA put out the Artemis Accords in 2022, and this sort of built on prior work by the Obama administration and the Trump administration, who had both essentially said, look, it's our understanding that you're not claiming sovereignty if you extract resources and then you sell them. That's a different thing, and our citizens are allowed to do that. The Artemis Accords have now been signed by over 20 nations that are working with the United States on the Artemis program. So this is an attempt to sort of clarify what you're allowed to do out in space. But, I talked to Chris Lewicki, who was at Planetary Resources, and he said one of the problems with getting investment is that a lot of people aren't sure what's going to happen when you first try to sell space resources back on Earth, for example. Is the rest of the international community that didn't sign on to the Artemis Accords going to feel like you're stealing something that was supposed to belong to everybody? And is that going to make it difficult to sell your product afterwards? So my understanding currently is that the legal ambiguity is holding back investment, although I'd be interested in hearing from other folks in this industry if they have found that to be the case as well. All right, so there's so many things you all could be working on. And honestly, I think a lot of this stuff is going to be really fascinating as we go through the process. So as someone who was trained as an ecologist, I would love to know more about, recycling our waste and creating sustainable ecosystems. So those closed loop ecology experiments sound really cool to me. I would love to see a research station on the moon where we have like a rodent colony that we, see, can it make it through multiple generations without dying? So on the moon, it would be exposed to all of space radiation and partial gravity. If they do well on the moon, they'd probably do well on Mars, and we could think about scaling up to the next round of experiments. So there's a lot of cool work to be done. I do feel like there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic, and hanging out with all of you makes me optimistic about all the cool stuff we're learning, and that the people who are working on these kind of projects are good people. So yeah, there we go. I managed to keep it under 40 minutes.